After the U.S. Senate had rejected Clement Haynsworth to replace resigned liberal U.S. Supreme Court Associate Justice Abe Fortas, President Kennedy proceeded to nominate George Harold Carswell, usually known as Harold Carswell, to fill the seat. He had been born in December 1919 and died in July 1992, aged 72. He was the United States Circuit Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit and a United States District Judge for the United States District Court for the Northern District of Florida. He was from Irwinton, Georgia, originally. He had graduated with a Bachelor of Laws degree from the Walter F. George School of Law at Mercer University in 1948. He had unsuccessfully campaigned for a seat in the Georgia State Legislature in 1948 as well. Then he had moved to Tallahassee, Florida, working as a private attorney from 1948 to 1953. After that, U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower appointed him a United States Attorney for the Northern District of Florida, and he served in that position until 1958. Then President Eisenhower nominated him to the United States District Court for the Northern District of Florida. The U.S. Senate confirmed him quickly. He served as that court's chief judge from 1958 to 1969. His service was terminated on June 1969 due to his elevation to the Fifth Circuit. Okay, yes. Yeah, sorry for my earlier mistake. Carswell was the first nominee by U.S. President Richard Nixon to fill the resigned Associate Justice Abe Fortas's seat on the U.S. Supreme Court. And already in May 1969, just when Fortas resigned from the court, Richard Nixon had jumped the gun to nominate Carswell. However, I'm sorry, I was confused. He was nominated by Richard Nixon in May 1969, right around the time when U.S. Supreme Court's Associate Justice Abe Fortas had resigned to the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. And for this position, the U.S. Senate quickly confirmed him in June 1969. Then, in April 1970, he resigned from his judicial position to run for the... I'm sorry. In January 1970, President Nixon nominated Mr. Judge Carswell to be an Associate Justice for the Supreme Court of the U.S. Supreme Court to replace Justice Abe Fortas. He was praised by Southern senators, including Richard Russell Jr. of Georgia. However, his critics noted that 58% of his decisions as a district court judge had been reversed, over half in other words. Others questioned his civil rights record, citing his voiced support for racial segregation and white supremacy during his unsuccessful Georgia legislative bid in 1948, while feminists accused him of being an opponent of women's rights. Various women, including U.S. Congresswoman Patsy Mink of Florida and Betty Friedan, testified before the U.S. Senate, opposed his nomination, and contributed to his defeat. The NAACP, upon learning of Judge Carswell's racist comments made in 1948, opposed his nomination and asked that his appointment be rejected by the U.S. Senate. U.S. Attorney General, or Justice Minister, to use the parliamentary language, John Mitchell, citing an extensive background check by the U.S. Justice Department, was willing to forgive, stating that it was unfair to criticize Carswell for political remarks made over 20 years earlier. In defense against charges that Carswell was mediocre, U.S. Senator Roman Hruska, a Nebraska Republican, stated, "There are a lot of mediocre judges and people and lawyers. They are entitled to a little representation, aren't they, and a little chance. We can't all have Brandeises, Frankfurters, and Cardozos," citing three famous U.S. Supreme Court justices. His remark was criticized by many and possibly damaged Judge Carswell's cause. In April 1970, the United States Senate rejected Carswell's nomination to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court by a vote of 45 to 51. Once again, as had happened some months earlier, or several months earlier, in the case of Judge Haynesworth, this decision divided both main U.S. political parties. 38 Democrats and 13 Republicans voted against Carswell's nomination, while 17 Democrats and 28 Republicans voted in favor of it. President Nixon, after learning of the result, accused Democrats of having an anti-Southern bias as a result, saying, "After the Senate's action yesterday in rejecting Judge Carswell, I have reluctantly concluded that it is not possible to get confirmation for the judge on the Supreme Court of any man who believes in the strict construction of the Constitution as I do, if he happens to come from the South." Strict construction means the doctrine according to which the judges should not legislate from the bench, but they should try to interpret the Constitution, in this case the U.S. Constitution, as close to the U.S. Constitution's author's original intentions and meanings given to various clauses of the U.S. Constitution as possible. And this approach has been criticized for being too narrow, for failing to account for the huge socio-economic, religious, political, technological, ethnic, racial, and other changes that have happened, or transformations that have happened since the U.S. Constitution was finalized in 1787. One week after Judge Carswell's nomination had been rejected, Nixon proceeded to nominate Minnesota Judge Harry Blackmun, a Republican who had a reputation of being at least a moderately conservative Republican judge.